good evening, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining this evening after another fabulous day. So one of my favorite things about traveling is then afterwards, after I've traveled to a place, reading about that place in a book or seeing it on a TV or in a movie or something like that, I feel like I have a real connection. And I was talking the other day about explorers and how we're here exploring. And so I would think that I'd get a really good connection with Shackleton coming here. But when we talk about all the hardships they had to endure here, it doesn't look that hard to be in Antarctica, does it? Antarctica is a pretty easy place to be, as it turns out. So, as one of the guests said to me on shore today, he says, well, what's the big deal? It's like, you get in a little boat, go for a ride. Look at it out there. It's flat calm. So we're going to still have to use our imaginations a little bit to imagine some of the things that they had to endure, but at least we've got I think a better sense of at least the geography that they were dealing with and stuff. So as we talk about Shackleton, and I use these three words, which are three words that pop up a lot in biographies about him and things that are written about him, and definitely put charm first. And as we're going to see in our talk, charm was a big part of him. He was a very brave man. He was a man that was always willing to roll up his sleeves and do whatever anyone else was doing, which wasn't really the British way at the time, and of course his leadership skills too, which really shone through. But he was a person, like we're all persons. He had these great benefits to him, and he also had some detractions as well. He had some people that disliked him. He had some things that he did very, very badly at. One person asked that I not take the shine off of him tonight. I'll try my best not to, but at the same time, he's a person just like we're all people. But he certainly is a person that we all, that many, many people celebrate today. He has a crater named after him on the moon. Many of you might have looked at least, if not read the book that's in your room about it. This was my first encounter with Shackleton, Kenneth Branagh's 2002 mini-series for Channel 4 in Britain about it. And I was recovering from minor surgery. It's the first time I'd ever used a DVD player was to watch that. And I was just mesmerized by the story. It was an absolutely magical story. This over here, great podcast, The Explorers, but he really gets in deep. So I'm going to spend about the next 40 minutes talking about Shackleton. If I don't give you enough, he's got 11 hours of just Shackleton. So check that out, and that'll keep you going for a very long time. I put it on to help me fall asleep at night, but because he's got a nice voice. And then we've got this mural over here. This mural just went up in County Kildare in 2022. That's a picture of Shackleton. And then there's some writing just to the left of it. And it says, the writing says, Sir Ernest Shackleton's name will forevermore be engraved with letters of fire in the history of Antarctic exploration. And those words were from Roald Amundsen, who was the first person to make it to the South Pole, who really held Shackleton in high esteem. So this guy that is just so big right now, like how did that happen? Well, he started out as a young guy in Ireland. He was Anglo-Protestant Irish. His mother's side of the family had been there for about 800 years since the Anglo-Norman invasion in the late 1100s. He was one of 10 children. He was the second oldest, 2 boys and 8 girls. My father has 7 sisters. He is also the second oldest, and so I know how well treated he was. His sisters treated him like a god, as my aunts treated my father when he was young. He got away with everything. So like I mentioned, that mural was in County Kildare. So that's County Kildare right there. That's where they lived. His father was a farmer, and for a variety of reasons decided that farming really wasn't going to work as a family. So Shackleton, born February 15th, 1874. When he was 6 years old in 1880, the father packed up and moved the family to Dublin, where he enrolled in medical school at Trinity College. Once he was done there, and after that, they moved to London. That was a huge move for them. Both sides of the families have been in Ireland for hundreds of years. But with the prospect of home rule coming up, his father just felt that was a better place to raise the family. So they moved into this house where they lived. Sadly, his mother didn't ever leave the house. After she had her last child, she basically was bedridden for the next 35 years of her life. She never really got out of bed again. Dad was very busy, though, as both a doctor and as with his hobbies. One of his hobbies is that he was really into the temperance movement. That was a big thing for him. And Shackleton later recalled that one of the things he did not like that his father made them do was on Saturday evenings, father would take the kids down to the pub and stand outside the pub and make them sing temperance songs to all the guys inside that were drinking. So, and as it turned out, in later years, Shackleton would have been one of the guys inside the bar drinking. So it's something that he and his dad did not agree on at all. He was enrolled in a preparatory school as a young lad. There he is there at the age of 10 after they had moved to London. Bullied quite a bit at first for his accent, which he worked very hard to get rid of. He felt that that was something he needed to move up in the world. But what he won over his classmates with was his charm. He could spin a story. He could get them to do just about anything. He was a very restless boy. He was very, very bright. He had an amazing memory, and he inherited his father's love of poetry. Tennyson was one of his favorite poets. He was a student at public school, but he was not a very good student at all. He actually tried to convince some of his friends once, because again, they used to skip out of school. He would tell them incredible stories about the sea. He loved Jules Verne, and one time he got them all to march down to the docks with him and try to, I think they were 13 at the time, and try to get on working on a ship and just sail away, and they were very rightly turned away. But it was something he was becoming more and more passionate about. His father, of course, wanted him to follow into medicine or do something that he thought had a little bit more respect to it, but Shackleton would have nothing to do with it. So his dad came up with a great idea. I'll sign him up to be a ship's boy, which is pretty much the lowest you can get on the ship. An old sailing ship called the Houghton Tower, which was going to be sailing from England all the way down around Cape Horn up to Valparaiso in Chile, picking up nitrate and then making the return journey back. It would take almost a year in horrific weather with some very disreputable people, and he thought that would kind of work itself out of his son, and it did the exact opposite. He loved it. He started to learn how to cuss like a sailor. He learned to smoke like a sailor and drink like a sailor, so it had the absolute opposite effect. So by the time he came back, he's like, nope, this is my life. My life is exploring. My life is adventure. My life is being at sea. So he did get himself hooked onto a tramp steamer line where he learned the ropes. He wrote, so he started all this in about 1890. By 1894, he had written his second officer's certificate. 1896, first officer's. 1898, he was now certified as a master. Legally, he could sail any ship in the United Kingdom. After he did his time learning the ropes on the tramp steamers, what really worked for him was getting on the nice lines, the fancy lines like Union Castle, especially making the run from Southampton down to Cape Town. And he was also able to make a lot of contacts as well, too, with the upper crust of society. And again, always looking for a way to charm people. But he would not just charm the upper crust, he charmed everyone. One of the crew members later remarked that he was not like other officers on the ships. And again, think of this time, turn of the century, or turn of the 20th century, United Kingdom, still a very structured, stratified society. Officers lived in an entirely different world than the rest of the crew. But Shackleton had nothing, had nothing for that. He was just as comfortable in the mess with the men as he was in the wardroom with the officers. But he was bored. He had spent a decade now at sea. He loved it, but he was always looking for something else. He was a strapping young man, now barrel-chested, quite good-looking, very comfortable with both the ladies and the men, and he was looking for some more adventure. And what he stumbled across was this grand expedition that was being planned. So the British were planning a great expedition now down to Antarctica using this ship called the Discovery, so it became known as the Discovery Expedition. So he was able to use one of his contacts, a young man that he had met on one of those trips from Southampton down to Cape Town, in order to get an interview with his father, who was one of the primary financial backers of the Discovery Expedition. And he got signed on as one of the officers. He got signed on as a third officer. Now, most of the other officers were all Navy men. He would never have been able to get into the Navy, into the Royal Navy. You either had to have the right connections or you had to have a lot of money. His family had neither. So he was, again, his charm, his gab that he was able to do, the way he was able to just turn people around, he was able to get on as a third officer. And of course, the captain of that expedition, many of us are familiar with him. I talked about him the other day, Robert Falcon Scott, with also his first major expedition being a captain of as well, and especially a polar expedition too. So the plan was, it was mostly to be a scientific. It had the backing of the Royal Geographical Society, leaving in 1901, and they were going to be heading down here to what is now known as the Ross Ice Shelf at the edge of it in the Ross Sea. But they also had another little idea back in their mind, is how far south could they go. Before that point, people were mostly looking how close to the North Pole we could get, well, how close to the South Pole. So they set themselves up on what is now in McMurdo Sound, Ross Island, at an area now called Hut Point. Did a lot of scientific research, but again, that idea Scott had and Shackleton very much wanted to be part of was how far south we can get, how close can we get to the South Pole. So again, Shackleton worked his way. He wasn't the most experienced man on board, but he was able to get himself hooked up enough with Scott and another man named Wilson, who was a doctor, to be part of that three-person team that was going to try to make their way as close as they could to the South Pole. They would have loved to have made it, but they didn't have any real illusions that they were actually going to make it. It was more about how close we can get, how can we work the equipment. These people were not really well suited for polar expeditions at first. They kind of learned along the way. And so they did trek out and made their way all the way to the south, and they actually made it as far as 82 degrees south, which was a huge accomplishment, just where the Trans-Antarctic Mountains start, which would have been a huge barrier for them. And why did they only make it that far? Well, they weren't well prepared, like I said. They had issues with scurvy. They had issues with hypothermia. They didn't have the right type of equipment, and they finally had to turn around and come back. On the way back, they were all so weak, but Shackleton in particular was so weak that he had to ride in the sledge and have the other men pull him, which was humiliating for him, but he was absolutely too weak. He didn't have the greatest heart. He had a great heart in that sense, but he didn't really have a great heart, and that would become a problem on his future expeditions as well. And so the looks of these men at the end of the expedition in February compared to when they started in November was absolutely unbelievable. How much weight they lost, the frostbite they had, the difficulties they had seen because of the snow blindness that they did. And like I said, Shackleton was in the worst shape. And this is what led to something that kind of really defined his life, and especially it defined his life with Captain Scott, is that when the relief ship came, about the same time they got back, Scott was sending a few men back. They were staying for one more year to do some more scientific research, but Shackleton was one of the men that was also sent home. And again, another humiliation for him. Shackleton wanted to be part of what was happening. He really felt he had pulled his own weight, and yet he kind of felt like he was being taken off the team. But being taken off the team actually worked well for him in a couple of ways. First off, he had been courting this woman for quite a few years, 7 years actually. And her father was a very prominent lawyer in London and wasn't really enamored with the idea of her marrying a man who worked on ships. But coming back from this expedition, he had a lot of positive publicity, and the father had approved just before he left. So when he got back, he married Emily Doran. She was 35 at the time. He was 6 years her junior. They ended up over the course of their marriage having 3 children. The youngest here, Edward, actually went off to be a very prominent Labour politician in the United Kingdom. Hard to believe he even had time to have 3 kids, because this is a guy that really had a hard time staying at home. He had a very hard time being, he loved the idea of being a husband and a father. He just wasn't very good at it. And his wife knew. She said, when I married him, I married a boy. I married a boy that was always going to want to go off on his next adventure. She was an incredibly patient woman. So now that he's back, he's going to, the other great thing about being sent back early is the rest of the team is still there in Antarctica. He's come back and he has this incredible story to share, and he could run a good story. So he started doing a series of lectures, which was very common for explorers to do to help pay the bills afterwards, and it helped to make him quite a bit of money. Unfortunately, he had this really bad habit when he did lectures of donating quite a bit of the money to charities because it would help him to get more publicity, but it did nothing for his wife and his children, and she had to rely on her inheritance from her father's fortune quite often to help pay the bills. So this is where we get to one of the things that kind of like takes the shine a little bit off Shackleton. He was an awful businessman. He was terrible, terrible with money. He got into all sorts of schemes after he came back in 1903. He sponsored a cigarette company. He ran for Parliament, a seat in Scotland, because he had moved the family there at one point for another business opportunity. He was terrible in the office. He came in 4th place out of 5 in his run for Parliament, so he did awful with that. Even future expeditions, I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but other expeditions, a future expedition, he became the actual official postmaster for Antarctica for New Zealand. So he was going to sell all these stamps that he thought people would collect. Nobody bought the stamps. Now they're worth a fortune. If he was around now, he'd be doing great, but at the time, it was a terrible idea. He tried to get some other people involved in a gold mine in Hungary, of all places, and that completely fell apart as well, too. So he wasn't great with money, which is kind of difficult as an explorer, because you need a lot of money to explore. So now he's got this publicity, which he soon lost once Scott and his group came back. Because Scott came back, he got the book deal, he got the better lectures now, he was seen as so much of a hero, and so now Shackleton needed something else to do. So he started to think, okay, maybe I can actually get my own expedition going, especially because Scott, being a Navy guy, had to go back and work for the Navy. So he was kind of out of the picture for a while. So Shackleton came up with this idea of the British Antarctic Expedition. He found a ship called the Nimrod. It wasn't a really great ship. It didn't look very good, but it was really seaworthy. He came to love this ship. He had a hard time putting the money together, but he was able to charm some people into giving him some cash, especially a couple of widows. He did really well with the widows. He also did great with a couple of gentlemen, one in particular, William Beardmore, who was an associate, a friend of his, but he was, Shackleton and Mr. Beardmore's wife were very, very, very close. Nothing's ever been proven, but the letters get a little sort of intimate and very friendly sometimes. Some people have suggested that Beardmore gave him money for the trip to get him out of the United Kingdom and away from his wife. I don't know if this story is true. So his idea was that he was going to go to the other side of the Ross Ice Shelf. Again, scientific, but way less scientific than Scott's expedition. He was in it for the glory of seeing if he could actually make it to the South Pole. He also wanted to redeem himself for what he felt was his failings on that first expedition. So he got a crew together on the Nimrod expedition, as it was often called. They went down to there, but unfortunately, they ended up setting up at Cape Royds, which is on the same side as the ice shelf as he was there with Scott. And why, unfortunately? Well, because Scott was planning in a couple of years to go back to Antarctica, and he kind of saw that as his home turf now. So before Shackleton left, he made a promise that he would use the other side of the Ross Ice Shelf. But when he got there, as I'll show you in a map in a moment, there wasn't anywhere for him to camp or set up a supply depot. And so he ended up breaking his word, which in the British world back then was a really bad thing to do. So here he is at Shackleton's hut, Cape Royds, very close to where Scott has been, and now they're looking for some sciencey type stuff to do while he's getting ready for his adventure there. Well, one of the things he did was he got a team to climb to the top of Mount Erebus, which is, Kelly will tell you there are 2 active volcanoes, but this is one that's actually really active, but don't tell Kelly I said that because I'm not a geologist, but this one is quite active still, and so his team was the first one to actually summit that and peer and look inside the volcano. Also, an incredible story, a whole lecture in itself. I'm not going to do any justice to it right now. 3 of the men that were on his expedition, the middleman in the middle, David, who was a geologist from Australia, and beside him, Mawson, Douglas Mawson is like the god of Antarctic exploration when it comes to the Australians. They did an incredible journey and were successful in finding the magnetic South Pole, which had been a huge goal for scientists, for geographers, for decades. So his team accomplished some absolutely amazing things on this mission, but for Shackleton, it was all about trying to get to the pole again. So this map shows the ship the first time it came in. The blue line, as you can see, he tried to live up to his word. He went over to the Bay of Whales near King Edward VII land, kind of sailed back and forth there, didn't work, ended up at the right side, and the green line is later on. The purple one here, that's the trip that Mawson and David and the other man took to find the magnetic South Pole. And then the red line, that important line, that was Shackleton's trip with 3 other men. And this is a picture of them at one of their stations with 3 other men trying to see how close they could get to the South Pole. Very importantly, they made it to those Trans-Antarctic mountains that you see there. They made it up the Beardmore Glacier. So that's the funny thing about Shackleton is, so Beardmore Glacier, named after William Beardmore, right? The guy that gave him all the money. Well, in a letter to Mrs. Beardmore, he told her that he named it after her. And there's, in later expedition, there's a couple of other places that were named after guys that gave him money. But in letters to their wives, he said, no, actually, I named it after you. So he was a pretty smooth guy. So anyways, they were able to make it up to the top of the polar plateau, but what they really ran out of is they ran out of time and food. It was getting to be a little too late in the season, and they just didn't have enough calories. They required like over 5,000 calories a day. They could use up 2,000 calories a night just shivering in their tents. And they were working sometimes on 2,500, sometimes even 2,000 calories. So they were making themselves very, very sick. And this is one of the positive things about Shackleton is he always put the welfare of his team first. He really wanted that glory of getting to the South Pole. Look at that, 88 degrees. Not only the furthest south anyone had ever been, but Nansen had only made it to 84 degrees towards the North Pole. So he was the closest to either pole at that point. So it was a huge thing to have to stop there and turn around. But if they would have made it. They would have made it to the South Pole, but all agree they would have never made it back. And again, the way he could charm people, that flag that he has there, that's a silk flag that was given to him by Queen Alexandra, the king of the United Kingdom's wife before he left. So he could charm anyone, even a queen. So this is what the men looked like when they got back. Again, a lot like that last picture with Scott and Wilson and Shackleton. It's like, I have absolutely no desire to do anything like this after looking at these after pictures of these men, and yet they just wanted to keep going back. Frank Wild in particular, over here, he suffered the most on the trip. Shackleton had suffered that last time, but now it was Frank Wild that suffered the most. And in fact, at one point, they were down to almost a biscuit a day. That was like the height of their day, eating their biscuit. And Frank was in such bad shape that Shackleton gave him his biscuit, and that was it for the rest of their lives, their common lives together. Wild was his right-hand man. He would do absolutely anything that he wanted. So he said to his wife when he got home after this trip, he said, "I thought you'd rather have a live donkey than a dead lion." So he was pretty dejected. I mean, he made the right call for sure, but it was still it was pretty hard pill to swallow. But when he got home, people went crazy. The crowds were amazing. He was made a knight, so that's why he's Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton. And very importantly is he had so much positive publicity that the newspapers pressured the government into paying off all of his debts. Because like I said, terrible with money. He had racked up a lot of bills on this one, and now everything was all free and clear. But he wasn't done yet with Antarctica. He still wanted to go back. He wanted to make another shot for the pole. And so imagine how he felt when the newspapers announced, this is a Norwegian newspaper, that the Norwegian flag planted at the South Pole, all well. And he realized his dream of that glory of being the first one to the pole was never going to happen. But that didn't slow him down at all. He had heard about a German expedition that had this audacious plan to actually go across Antarctica. But they were having a lot of issues, and so he got his own team together. But again, he moved a little too fast, didn't really think about the finances that well, and as we're going to see, things didn't really work out the way we wanted to. So what his plan was, so there's two sides to Antarctica there. He was going to be starting from the top side in the Weddell Sea, so he was going to be coming down with his ship there and his team, and they were going to make a run, get to the South Pole, and then continue back over to where he was before. Another team was going to travel around to New Zealand or Australia. They hadn't quite decided yet, and it was going to travel up to the Ross Sea to lay a bunch of supply depots for him close up to the Beardmore Glacier, so he wouldn't have to carry everything with him to make his trip across. He put an ad in the paper for this. He received 5,000 applications for this ad, which apparently stated, for those that are watching on TV may not be able to see, men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. This one's been made into posters. You can get it on t-shirts, and it's probably made up. There's actually a reward out right now for somebody to find the newspaper that this was in, and no one has been able to prove that this actually even existed. And I hate stories like that. This is one thing I hate about history, is all these great stories that you just love, somebody's able to prove that they're not real. So, but he did receive over 5,000 applications. He put them into 3 categories, possible, mad, and no way, basically. Into the no way pile went the 3 women that applied, who felt that men shouldn't get all the glory, and they were more than happy to put on men's clothes if that would help them to get the job, but there was no way Shackleton was doing that, so they were unfortunately turned down. He had a lot more money for this one because he was knighted now, so he was like someone a bit higher in society, so he had a much better, bigger, better, more comfortable ship, but as it turns out, it didn't handle as well as the Nimrod. He was very happy with the comfort level of it, but he wished he had his own Nimrod ship instead. He had a great team. The team that he collected for himself. Don't forget, he had to hire teams for both expeditions, and his team, he put sort of all of the apples in one basket. Frank Wild was back along, that right-hand man of his, which he would be proved to be invaluable. Another major member of the team, Tom Crean, who had a lot of experience in Antarctica. He was an Irishman from the Dingle Peninsula. And very lucky he had this man, Frank Worsley, along. Shackleton had a first choice, a man named Davies, to be his captain of the Endurance, because he was going to be the commander, not the captain of the ship. But that man turned him down, and Worsley just happened to walk into his office one day. He was a New Zealander who happened to be in London, and he really helped to save this expedition. Really great team. Another man that was really great was also Frank Hurley, an Australian, and we don't see a picture of him here because he was the guy that was always taking the pictures, because Shackleton knew when he came back he needed pictures, he needed film footage so that he could fill up those lecture theaters again, those halls, and make all the money back from the debts he was now accumulating again on this adventure. So the men sailed out in 1914. They almost didn't get to sail away because about 5 days before they were leaving London is when World War I was officially declared. But Winston Churchill gave them the nod to go. To not stay. He got a little bit of flack for that in a couple of years later on when the war was still on and he had been sort of gone for it, but Winston Churchill was the one that told them to go. They made their way down the Atlantic Ocean, ended up at the beginning of December in Grytviken, which was a Norwegian whaling station in South Georgia Island. The whalers there said they had never seen ice as bad as they were seeing that year in the Weddell Sea, but that didn't stop them. On the 5th of December, they left to head into the Weddell Sea. The star should be a little bit more up, but it kept moving when I was trying to do it there, because they were trying to get to a bay right near where the R is on Ron Ice Shelf, Vassal Bay. But that as soon as they got, within 2 or 3 days of sailing away from South Georgia Island, they were into some pack ice. That was getting harder and harder to thread. At one point, Worsley made the suggestion, we've got another bay that we could get to. It's just right here. But it would add a couple hundred miles to his land travel. And so Shackleton turned him down, which was a major mistake on his part. Because by late December, early January, the men were actually trying to pick a way to find a path for the ship, even for a path for the ship to get out. And they were unsuccessful. On the 15th of January of 1915, the ship was encased in the ice, and it was there to stay. Now, that wasn't it was a disappointment, but it wasn't a huge panic. Many ships had been encased in ice before and had survived successfully. But again, the Endurance wasn't quite as seaworthy as, say, the Nimrod was. So, but Shackleton, one of the things he also knew how to do well was how to keep people busy and how to to keep things positive. When he was on Scott's expedition, he set up a little newspaper, a monthly newspaper in Antarctica that really kept the men's spirits up. Here he encouraged them to get out and play some football, some soccer. They had plays, they had poetry readings on the ship. He understood, especially because don't forget, they were encased in the summertime in January, the austral summer, but winter was approaching, which means just darkness, and that really plays on the minds of people. But he was the one that was able to keep everyone's spirits up during that time. But unfortunately, after that long winter, spring comes in September, but things start to go really bad for the ship. This is a beautiful shot that Hurley took of the ship during that long winter night. An absolutely famous, gorgeous picture that he took. But by mid-October, the pressure of that ice, again, not a really great polar ship that he had, was starting to list the ship and also starting to press it. He finally had to make the decision on the 27th of October for everyone to abandon ship. So they got as much of the stuff off the ship as they possibly could. This is what the ship looked like a couple of days later. And then by mid-November, you can see that the masts are starting to come down now. Everything is just being crushed. Finally, on the 17th of November, a couple of days after this picture was taken, the ship sank to the bottom of the ocean, 3 kilometers down. Worsley was very careful, though, in his log to note as best he could the latitude and longitude of when it sunk. And then the men settled in to decide what is going to happen next. Shackleton's idea was that they were going to take the 3 lifeboats that they had. They had one large one, just over 20 feet, and 2 smaller ones. And they were going to drag them across the ice to an island called Paulet Island, which they assumed was about 200 kilometers away. And the nice thing about Paulet Island is that in 1902, a Swedish expedition had gotten stuck there, and they had built a hut there, and there was also some supplies there. They tried for the first week of hauling those sledges. They only got 9 miles in an entire week and realized that that just wasn't going to happen. Again, just burning up way too many calories. So instead, they set up a camp. They set up a camp on the ice. At first, they called it Ocean Camp, and then they had to call it another name later on because the ice all started to break apart. They ended up on actually a fairly small ice floe. They actually had to start sleeping fully dressed and had to have watches on in the night because sometimes literally the ice would crack in the night while they were sleeping. And they had to also make sure, of course, that all the men and the equipment were all together. So this had started in November the 17th, and it went on until the following April. Can you imagine that, living on ice floes for that long? Finally, the ice was breaking up enough in both of a good way and a bad way. In a bad way that it was getting too dangerous to stay where they were, but in a good way is that now they could actually launch their boats and hopefully get to an island where they could be rescued. Paulet Island was now out of the picture. They had drifted too far away. They were thought maybe they might be able to make it to a place called Hope Bay at the end of the peninsula, or possibly even King Edward Island, close to where we're going to be in a couple of days, King George Island, excuse me. However, the currents and the waves and the winds were pushing them in the wrong direction. So these men spent about 15 days before they made it to Elephant Island. So for the first time since they were encased in the ice of January the 15th of 1915, now we're in 1916, April, and here they are at Elephant Island for the first time. They have fresh water from the glaciers. They have a little bit of food from the seals, but unfortunately they're in an island that's off of all shipping routes. There's no whaling stations there or anything close to it. There's nothing there's no way that they're going to be saved before they perished. And so this is probably where Shackleton made his best decision, and again, always putting the welfare of the crew first. So he had started, the ship got encased in ice over here and had drifted here. There was a huge gyre in the Weddell Sea, so it was going to be pulling them in a big circle. This is where they had to get onto the ice floe all the way up to here. So now they made that travel there in the boats to Elephant Island. They had really wanted to go here or here, but that wasn't going to happen. And now he's got to get somewhere where he can get help. He would have again liked to have gone back this way, but the currents, winds pushing in the wrong direction. The Falkland Islands are just over here, but again, they were closer. There was civilization there, but again, it wasn't going to work. So an 800-mile trip to South Georgia Island at least would be following the currents and the winds properly. That island is only 100 miles long, so they had to be able to make a journey 800 miles using technology of the early 20th century, and they did it in the largest of their 3 lifeboats. The Carpenter was able to extend the boat this way about 9 inches to give them a little bit more freeboard. And they also encased the top of it as well. This is a picture of a replica of the boat that I took in Punta Arenas last month. It is not that big. It's 22.5 feet long. My own boat at home is 24 feet long. And there were 6 men that were going to have to get in this boat and travel 800 miles across the open ocean. That Drake Passage that we were also nervous about last week, they're going to be spending days and days in it. In fact, they spent 16 days in it. There were 3 jobs that they had to do after they took off from the island. Oh, and by the way, named it the James Caird after one of his, this time it was actually after the guy and not the wife. The James Caird after one of the men that had given him quite a bit of money. So they had 3 jobs on it. 6 men went. You were either sailing, so you were holding the rudder, you were steering, you were sailing, or you were bailing, because water was constantly coming over the side. The other 3 men were supposed to be sleeping. They hardly ever slept. The most exciting part of their day was meal time. I almost got sick when I read what their meal was. So their meal was basically, there was like hot milk, and it was mixed with pemmican, which is dried meat, but not good beef jerky meat. No, it's not great. I've had it before. And lard and oatmeal and salt and sugar. That was all mixed together. It was mixed with powdered milk and water, and that was the highlight of their day. Because it warmed their soul. Tom Crean was the cook. He had to keep the stove in between his knees while he could try to warm up the milk. It was in absolutely horrific conditions. Apparently, the inside of this little tiny boat just covered in vomit and just smelled absolutely disgusting. They all ended up with diarrhea. I'm sorry, this is an awful story, but this will keep you from ever wanting to do what these guys had to do, because this was an unbelievable journey. Worsley was only able to make 4 correct sextant readings during the entire voyage. So he used basically dead reckoning and a reading of the wind and the waves to find that 100-mile island 800 miles away. It was just an absolute incredible feat. It's considered still to this day the most incredible small vessel voyage in history. So they ended up at South Georgia, as we see from this painting here. They made it, but on the 15th day they made it, but a hurricane-force winds and waves almost 100 feet tall kept them from actually reaching the island. That same storm, there was another vessel, a 500-ton coal ship, trying to bring coal to South Georgia Island from the north. It was actually sunk in that storm, but they were able to keep that little ship afloat until they actually landed at South Georgia. They landed at another bay, which was a horrible place to land, and once they had enough strength, they sailed around to King Haakon Bay. Now they're here at South Georgia. Just a little bit of a problem. They're on the south side of the island. There are 3 whaling stations on South Georgia Island. They're all on the north side of the island. By this point, 3 of the men are in such bad shape they couldn't even move. The James Caird, their little ship, is in such bad shape it's never going to make it back. And so Shackleton came up with the ideas. Okay, we're going to walk across the island, and this is what the island looks like. No one had ever walked across it before. Oh, and by the way, we don't really have any materials left or anything. So we're basically just going to walk straight. We're just going to keep on walking. No sleeping bags, no tent, nothing to slow us down. So they arrived on the island on the 10th of May, and they left about 8 days later, once they were able to build up some strength. And this was the path that they ended up taking. You can see as they went up to here and got up over to Possession Bay, but realized they were not nearly anywhere close to them. Plus, it was too steep to go down. Back over to here, and then look at these little loops. Every time they came to a major crevasse, crevasse or another mountain they couldn't get through. This part right here, they actually slid down almost 1,000 feet to get to the bottom. Like they could have easily just gone right over the edge, but at every step of the way, somebody was on their side for this voyage. They got down close to the Stormness, one of the 3 villages, and they actually started to hear the whistles of the ships. So they walked into the village. Children were running away from them. They ended up at the manager's office. The manager who had met Shackleton a couple of years before when they were at Grytviken didn't even recognize him at all. Had no idea who they were. Men quickly got cleaned up. They had their first bath in almost 2 years. They had a good meal. Worsley, of course, Shackleton right away wanted to start making plans for a rescue of the other men still left on Elephant Island. Remember, there's still 22 men there. Worsley, of course, needed to get those other 3 men who were still stuck on the other side at King Haakon Bay. So he went over with the team to get them. The men were so overjoyed that the rescuers came, but they were a little discouraged that none of the 3 men that they had traveled with actually came back to rescue them. They didn't even recognize Worsley. He didn't look anything like he had looked like for the last 2 years, and all cleaned up, and they didn't even recognize him at first. It was absolutely incredible. So now we've got 6 men rescued, but we still have 22 men in jeopardy. Just wanted to show, by the way, before the next slide, that the original James Caird, I showed you a picture of one I took that was a replica. The original is now actually the high school that Shackleton went to in England. It's really the only good thing that Shackleton gave to that school, because his educational experience, according to his teachers, was not good. So it's good that he put that in. So anyways, they were able to get word out to the world that he was okay, but that, of course, as it says here, that his men still, those 22 men, were in grave danger. And so he was able to get a ship, the Southern Sky, from the South George Island. It's a Norwegian ship, to make the trip, but couldn't quite get there. Look at how close that blue line got to Elephant Island, but there was just too much weather. Now, this is also, I said, he got there in mid-May, so now we're getting into June, and of course, that's the southern winter, more and more ice, so it was getting more and more desperate. So he convinced them to take the Southern Sky up to the Falkland Islands, thought he could get a different vessel there. He was able to get a Uruguayan vessel to make the second attempt, made it a little bit closer, but still not quite there. Back they went. He went over to Punta Arenas. They made another attempt with a ship called the Emma. The Emma didn't work out. It ended up having to go back to the Falkland Islands as well. And finally, on the 4th attempt in August now, so those men have been alone on that island for almost 4 months. They have no idea if Shackleton and the others are even alive anymore. But this young pilot of a ship called the Yelcho, a Chilean ship out of Punta Arenas, he was able to get close enough so that Shackleton could see to the shore to get there's the Yelcho just offshore there. This is Frank Hurley's pictures again, that the photographer that was along, able to get to shore and to count that all 22 men were still there and they were still safe. And so that usually is the end of the Shackleton story, that amazing story that he was able to, out of this disaster, to save all of his men. But don't forget, there was a whole nother part of the expedition there. We had the other team that went to the Ross Ice Shelf. So remember, we had the Shackleton group up here in the Weddell Sea, but we had the other group that was supposed to be laying those supply depots over here. Now, unfortunately, this group wasn't as well trained, didn't have nearly enough money. When they got to Hobart to buy more supplies, they found out that Shackleton had not wired any money ahead for them, so they had to sort of beg, borrow, and steal. And their ship, the Aurora, wasn't the greatest ship as well. So they did make their way from Hobart in Tasmania all the way to Ross Island. They're unloading all of the supplies. A little bit of a storm picks up, and the chains of the Aurora break off, and the ship drifts away. And then its rudder breaks, and so it can't even steer to get back to them anymore. So the men are stuck at Ross Island with not enough supplies for themselves, but yet they still figure out that they have to do what Shackleton sent them there to do. So they still made the effort to set those supply depots on there. 3 men lost their lives doing that. So whenever I hear someone say that, the Shackleton expedition, everyone came back safely, well, 3 of the men did not. And it was due to laying those supply depots that, of course, never ended up being used. So the Aurora made their way back to New Zealand eventually. A passing ship helped to tow them back. Now they needed some repairs. There's no money. It cost almost $1 million for the rescue in today's dollars, almost $1 million for the rescue. So the British, Australian, and New Zealand governments said, okay, we'll pick up the tab, for we're taking over now. No one else has anything to do with this. That was hard for Shackleton, who had just now rescued his other men and felt responsible for this crew as well. So he was able to make his way over to New Zealand. He was able to talk his way again. The guy had the way to talk because the governments were saying, you're not part of this. This was a bit of a disaster, this trip, so we're going to fix it up now. But he was able to get himself on as a supernumerary officer. So that was December of 1916, and on the 10th of January 1917, they actually landed at Ross Island, and they were able to rescue the men that were there. So a lot of historians believe that this expedition took place from 2014 to 2016, because that's, of course, when the folks over on the Weddell Sea were rescued. But for me, it's in 1917, January 10th, 1917, when the last of the men were brought back. So now he's back in the United Kingdom again. He's got his pictures. He's got a little bit of film, not as much as he would have had because they had to leave a lot of stuff behind. But he had a pretty incredible speaking tour. Actually, on the way back from New Zealand, he didn't even go home. He went to the United States and did a lecture tour there. So now his wife hasn't seen him for like almost 4 years, but he's got a lecture tour to do. And of course, what does he do with most of the money? He gives away to charity. So he's like basically has the big borrow and steal to make his way across the Atlantic from New York to get home to his family. Does his lectures, but of course it's also in the midst of World War I still, so it's not quite the turnout that he was expecting. He did get his polar medal. He got his 3rd bar on his polar medal now. His buddy Frank Wild is only one of 2 men in the world that got 4 bars, 4 major expeditions to Antarctica during that heroic age. But he got his 3rd one on there. Most of the members of his crew ended up joining the military. Sadly, a couple of them died. One died within 6 months of getting back. So you imagine they went through all of that and then ended up dying in the war just a few months later. Shackleton became a little bit at odds and ends. He offered to go to Argentina and Chile to try to convince those 2 countries to join the Allied effort in World War I. That didn't work out. He was posted into Russia to try to keep the supply lines open there, but then of course the conflict between the Reds and the White with the Russian Revolution, that all fell apart as well. And so now here he is, almost 45 years old. What am I going to do with my life? I'm going to go on another trip. So what he wanted to do was organize what he called, every trip was one last trip. Every letter to his wife was, one last trip and I'm done with this. I'm all good. So here he is with some promotional material. He actually wanted to go back into the Arctic. He wanted to do some scientific research in the Arctic, but the Canadian government said absolutely no way, because if anything goes wrong, we are not paying to have to come and rescue you. So he was able to convince some of his old compatriots from his last voyages to rejoin him again. Some of them never got completely paid from the last voyage, but yet they still joined him again because he was that kind of guy. So the idea was they were going to circumnavigate the Antarctic continent. They were going to do some mapping, especially in Etterby Land, which wasn't really well mapped at the time. They had a nice little ship called the Quest that he was able again to purchase. Now this expedition, he basically got one guy, an old schoolmate from his college days, from his public school, who made a lot of money in rum sales, got him to pay for the entire expedition. So the expedition was officially called the Shackleton Rowett Expedition after their 2 last names. So they left in the August of 1921 on their way down to South America. They had to make some repairs on the ship in Madeira, made it to Rio de Janeiro, where he had very serious chest pains. They called the doctor. He said, absolutely nobody is checking out my heart. Everything is absolutely fine. Kept on going, and they made it all the way to South Georgia. At that time, all the publicity is going now. They didn't really have a plan. This was a great picture. There was no plane on there. There was nothing even really happening, but now here he is. He's back in South Georgia. It's the beginning of January now of 1922, and January 4th, he has this beautiful, beautiful entry about being back on South Georgia, which I'll just read for you now. At last, after 16 days of turmoil and anxiety, on a peaceful, sun-shining day, we came to anchor in Grenviken. How familiar the coast seems as we passed down. We saw with full interest the places we struggled over after the boat journey. Now we must speed all that we can, but the prospect is not too bright, for labor is scarce. The old smell of dead whale permeates everything. It is a strange and curious place. A wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover gem-like above the bay. So he wrote that late in the evening on January the 4th. During the night, he started to have some chest pains again. The doctor was called at about 2 a.m. He asked the doctor what he should do. The doctor said, well, take some aspirin, number 1, and stop drinking, number 2. He took the aspirin. He went back to sleep, and at about 2:50 a.m., he passed away. So he died in South Georgia. They made plans immediately to continue with the expedition. They tried. They went to a couple of places, but it really fell apart. There was a few members on the team stayed behind to make plans to bring the body back to London. However, his wife wired back that this is the place that he always wanted to be. He was always striving to be on an adventure, and so that's where he should be buried. So as many of you know, it's a huge attraction now for those that visit South Georgia Island, is his grave there that they made for him. And that wasn't the end of the story of his grave, though, in South Georgia Island. Frank Wild, that right-hand man of his, he went on to do some more sailing, ended up emigrating to South Africa, where he died in 1939. And his ashes ended up in a vault where they were just sort of kind of forgotten for years and years and years, until a researcher came across them in the early 2000s. And so with the permission of his descendants, with his family, they actually took the ashes from South Africa, and at the end of November in 2011, they had a procession into the same cemetery in South Georgia, and they reburied his ashes there. And he's got his name, he's got the date, and underneath it just says Shackleton's right-hand man. So the two of them are back together again. So the postscript of this story, of course, is the one that many of us are familiar. Pretty thrilling a couple of years ago when it was announced that the Endurance had been found. Remember, I mentioned that Frank Worsley had very carefully noted down the latitude and longitude when the ship sunk. He was an excellent seamanship. He was almost bang on. So with some pretty great technology as well, an expedition went in March of 2022, and they were able to find the ship in excellent, excellent condition at the bottom of the Weddell Sea here. You can clearly see the name Endurance. The name Endurance comes from his family motto. The ship was originally actually named the Polaris, just like our ship. It was actually a ship that was built for the tourist trade in the Arctic, and there's a couple other explorer connections to that, which are quite cool. But that's not the end of the story with his ships as well, because don't forget he had that other ship, the Quest, that he sailed on as well on his last voyage that he died on. Well, the Quest went on to do some more exploration for other teams. It was part of the Royal Canadian Navy in World War II, and then it became a Norwegian sailing ship after that. But it sunk. It sunk in 1962 off the coast of Newfoundland. And just a couple of months ago, in June 2024, a Royal Canadian Geographic team were successful in finding the Quest at the bottom of the North Atlantic. And the co-patron of that expedition was Alexandra Shackleton, the daughter of Edward Shackleton, who was the youngest child of Ernest Shackleton. So the granddaughter was able to be part of a pretty major expedition. So we end up with this man. You know, he wasn't a great businessman. He was terrible with money. He was way too flirty with the ladies. But man, he could move a room. He could spin a yarn, and he could get men to follow him anywhere, because he was able to do anything himself. And the last word goes to a gentleman that sailed with him as part of the Scott expedition and went on to be a major explorer himself. His name is Sir Raymond Priestley, and in the 1950s he said, "I want Scott for scientific method, Amundsen for speed and efficiency, but when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." So warts and all, he was a pretty incredible man. At the turn of the century, of this last century, I've gone way over my time, I'm sorry, but stick around because there's a documentary and they'll have popcorn for that. I asked if they'd give the popcorn for you, but they said no. Anyways, at the end, you know, the turn of the millennial there, where there was the top 100 of everything for the last century, century, there was a list in the United Kingdom that was voted on with the top 100 Britons of the 20th century. Robert Scott came in 54th, Shackleton came in 11th. So as Scott's star has fallen over the decades, Shackleton's just seems to be rising and rising. A pretty incredible man. So thank you for letting me ramble on about this great guy for a little while here. Sorry to go over my time. Enjoy another incredible day tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you here at 9 o'clock in the morning for our briefing, and then another great day as we enter Mickelson Harbor tomorrow afternoon. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.